Tonight, we begin our long journey into one of the greatest mysteries of human history, the fall of the Roman Empire. For nearly 5 centuries, Rome ruled a vast stretch of the known world. Its armies marched across continents, its laws shaped civilizations, its language, Latin, became the root of many that followed. Its roads carried merchants, soldiers, and stories from one end of the empire to the other. And yet, it fell, slowly, almost imperceptibly at first, like a great marble statue, beginning to crack beneath its own weight. Historians have debated for centuries, why did this empire, so powerful, so organized, so vast, come to an end? Was it a sudden collapse, or a gradual fading into something else? Was it the sword of the invader, the rot from within, or the slow shifting of the world's balance? Before we answer these questions, we must first step back in time to see Rome not in its final days, but in its height. For only by understanding its greatness can we truly understand its fall. Picture the empire at its zenith, around the year 117 AD, under the reign of Emperor Trajan. The borders stretched from the stormy Atlantic coasts of Hispania in the west to the deserts of Arabia in the east, from the windswept hills of Britannia in the north to the lush Nile Valley of Egypt in the south. More than 60 million people lived under the Roman banner, united, at least in theory, by the same laws, the same coinage, and the same emperor. But this vastness was both Rome's greatest strength and its deepest vulnerability. An empire so wide required constant attention, like a garden stretching beyond the horizon, where weeds might grow unseen in far-off corners. Maintaining the peace, the Pax Romana demanded armies stationed at every frontier, governors in every province, and a constant flow of wealth to keep the machine running. Even in these golden years, small cracks were beginning to form. The empire's expansion had reached its natural limits. No longer could Rome simply conquer new lands to fuel its economy with plunder and new taxpayers. Instead, it had to hold and maintain what it already had, an infinitely harder task. The frontiers were long and restless, from the wild tribes of Germania to the fierce Parthians in the east. In the capital, the grandeur of the Forum and the Colosseum dazzled the eyes. Senators debated under the shadow of marble columns. Markets overflowed with goods from every corner of the empire. Silk from China, spices from India, grain from Egypt. But this prosperity masked growing challenges. The empire's wealth was unevenly spread. While the elite feasted on exotic delicacies, much of the population lived modestly, dependent on the grain dole from the state. And deep beneath the polished surface of Roman life, forces were already at work. Political rivalries, economic strains, cultural shifts that would one day weaken the foundations of this mighty empire. Over the next chapters, we will explore these forces in detail. Some will be familiar: wars, invasions, and political assassinations. Others are quieter, but no less powerful: the slow corrosion of civic duty, the drain of resources, the changing climate, even diseases that swept through the crowded cities. But tonight, as the story begins, we stand in the bright midday of Roman glory. The legions are strong, the roads are safe. The emperor's authority stretches farther than any before him. And yet, somewhere beyond the edges of the map, a storm is beginning to gather. If we are to understand why the Roman Empire fell, we must first understand what held it together for so long. At its core, Rome's strength lay in 3 great pillars: its military, its administration, and its culture. Each of these supported the other, forming an intricate balance that allowed the empire to thrive for centuries. But like pillars of stone, once cracks began to appear, the weight above them became too much to bear. Let us begin with the military, the pride of Rome. The Roman legions were not just soldiers. They were the most disciplined, organized, and effective fighting force the ancient world had ever seen. A legion was a finely tuned machine of around 5,000 men, divided into cohorts and centuries, each commanded with precision. Soldiers were trained not just to fight, but to march, build, and fortify. They could construct a bridge in a matter of days, lay siege to a city for months, or cross vast distances with a speed that stunned their enemies. These armies were the empire's shield and sword, protecting its borders and enforcing its will. Yet they were also expensive to maintain. A soldier needed pay, armor, weapons, and food. Multiply that by hundreds of thousands of soldiers stationed across the empire's far-flung territories, and you can imagine the strain on the imperial treasury. In the early days, conquest paid for the army. New lands brought new wealth, but when expansion stopped, the cost of defense remained, and the income from conquest vanished. This led us to the second pillar, administration. Rome's bureaucracy was a marvel of its time. Governors ruled the provinces, collecting taxes and enforcing the law. A vast network of scribes, messengers, and officials ensured that orders from Rome could reach the edge of the empire in weeks. The Roman legal system, with its codes, courts, and procedures, created a sense of order that bound diverse peoples together. But administration also depended on loyalty, and loyalty was not always guaranteed. Corruption crept in, as some governors and officials saw their positions as opportunities for personal enrichment rather than public service. Taxes collected in the provinces did not always make their way back to Rome. Over time, the cost of governance rose, while the trust between the center and the provinces weakened. The third pillar was culture, the shared identity of being Roman. It was more than just citizenship. It was the idea that to be part of Rome was to belong to a greater whole. Roman roads, Roman law, and the Latin language connected peoples from Britain to Egypt. The empire allowed local customs to survive, but it also spread its own architecture, art, and values. Temples, amphitheaters, and baths in distant lands reminded everyone of the empire's presence. However, culture is not fixed. Over the centuries, the empire absorbed countless influences from the peoples it conquered. While this diversity enriched Rome, it also changed it. The traditional virtues that Romans once celebrated, discipline, duty, and simplicity, began to give way to luxury, spectacle, and personal ambition. Writers of the later empire lamented that the citizens had grown soft, preferring the circus and the theatre to the call of service. As these three pillars began to weaken, outside pressures mounted. In the north, Germanic tribes, once pushed back by Rome's legions, grew bolder. In the east, the Parthians, and later the Sassanid Persians, were constant rivals. The empire's borders were like a long wall that needed constant guarding, and there were always cracks to mend. Yet in the year 180 AD, with the death of Emperor Marcus Aurelius, a turning point approached. Known as the last of the five good emperors, Marcus was a philosopher king who had tried to hold the empire together through wisdom and discipline. His death brought to the throne his son, Commodus, a man whose reign would mark the beginning of a slow but steady unraveling. The shift from capable rulers to weaker, more self-serving ones would become one of the defining patterns of Rome's decline. But as we shall see, it was never just one cause. nor a single moment, that brought the empire down. It was the accumulation of many small fractures over centuries, until the weight became too much for even Rome to bear. In the next part, we will step into the reign of Commodus and the chaotic century that followed, a period historians call the crisis of the 3rd century, when Rome seemed to teeter constantly on the edge of collapse. When Marcus Aurelius died in the year 180 AD, the Roman Empire still looked strong on the surface. Its borders were defended, its cities were prosperous, and its people enjoyed the peace and stability of the Pax Romana that had lasted for nearly 2 centuries. But the new emperor, Commodus, would begin a chain of events that revealed just how fragile the empire's foundations had become. Commodus was unlike his father. Where Marcus was disciplined, thoughtful, and deeply concerned for the welfare of the empire, Commodus preferred personal luxury, public adoration, and the thrill of spectacle. He saw himself not just as an emperor, but as a living god, even going so far as to dress as Hercules and fight in the gladiatorial arena. While this delighted some of the Roman public, it shocked and dismayed the Senate and the army. An emperor's role was to lead, to protect, to inspire, not to entertain. During his reign, Commodus neglected the administration of the empire. He allowed corrupt favorites to handle affairs of state, while he focused on games, ceremonies, and his own image. This opened the door for widespread bribery and incompetence within the government. Taxes were misused, military readiness declined, and the trust between the emperor and the Senate reached new lows. His assassination in 192 AD plunged Rome into a brief but violent period of instability. In the year 193 AD alone, Rome saw 5 different emperors, a sign that the throne had become a prize to be won by whoever could muster the most military support. It was a dangerous shift. For centuries, emperors had been chosen carefully, often through adoption of capable successors. Now, the position was decided by force and bribery. This instability only grew worse during what historians call the crisis of the 3rd century to 35 to 284 AD. It was a time when the empire nearly collapsed under the weight of its own troubles. In just 50 years, Rome saw over 20 emperors, most of whom came to power through violence, and were quickly replaced by the next challenger. Assassinations became common. Loyalty shifted rapidly from one leader to another. The idea of Rome as a stable, eternal force began to fade. At the same time, external threats multiplied. In the north, Germanic tribes like the Goths and Vandals tested Rome's defenses, raiding deeper into imperial territory. In the east, the Sassanid Persian Empire rose to power, defeating Roman armies and capturing key cities. The empire's frontiers were no longer secure. Adding to the chaos were economic and social problems. Civil wars drained resources. Trade routes became unsafe. A deadly plague, possibly smallpox or measles, swept through the empire, killing millions and weakening both the population and the army. With fewer farmers and workers, food production fell. Prices rose sharply. A period of severe inflation began to grip the economy. In some provinces, local leaders began to act more like independent rulers than loyal Roman officials. The unity that had once been the empire's strength was breaking down. Even the legions, once the symbol of Rome's discipline, were now often loyal only to their generals, not to Rome itself. Yet Rome did not fall in this moment. It adapted, as it had done many times before. Some emperors during this period, like Aurelian, managed to restore order temporarily, reclaiming lost territories and reforming the army. But the underlying problems, political instability, economic strain, and the constant pressure of external enemies remained. The crisis of the 3rd century was like a fever that revealed the sickness within. Even when the fever broke, the patient was weaker than before. The empire had survived, but at a cost. The centralized power of Rome was shaken, its resources stretched, and its people weary from decades of turmoil. In the next part, we will look at the reforms that tried to save the empire, most notably those of Emperor Diocletian, and how even these solutions carried seeds of future troubles. By the late 3rd century, the Roman Empire had endured decades of chaos. Assassinations, invasions, civil wars, economic collapse, all had pushed Rome to the brink. Then, in the year 284 AD, a new leader rose to power, Diocletian. He was a skilled general and a man of vision. Determined to restore order to a crumbling world, Diocletian understood that no single man could control the vast, diverse lands of the empire alone. Its borders stretched thousands of miles, from the cold, stormy coasts of Britannia to the sun-baked deserts of Egypt, from the dense forests of Germania to the rugged mountains of Armenia. Messages could take weeks to travel from one end to the other. By the time news of a rebellion or invasion reached Rome, it was often too late to respond effectively. His solution was bold: divide the empire's rule without breaking it apart. In 93 AD, Diocletian created the Tetrarchy, or Rule of Four. The empire would be governed by two senior emperors, called Augusti, and two junior emperors, called Caesars. Each would oversee a specific region, with their own court, army, and administration. In theory, this would allow faster responses to threats and more efficient governance. Diocletian himself took the eastern half of the empire, ruling from Nicomedia, while his co-Augustus, Maximian, governed the west from Milan. Under them, the Caesars Galerius and Constantius Chlorus managed the frontier provinces. This system brought a measure of stability, and for a time, the empire began to heal. But Diocletian did more than reorganize leadership. He launched sweeping reforms in nearly every part of Roman life. The army was strengthened and reorganized, with more focus on mobile units that could respond quickly to raids. Fortifications along the frontiers were repaired and expanded. New provinces were created to improve local administration, and governors were given clearer responsibilities. Economically, Diocletian tried to tackle inflation, a problem that had plagued Rome for decades. Prices had risen sharply due to constant wars, loss of trade routes, and the devaluation of Roman coins. To combat this, Diocletian issued the Edict on Maximum Prices in 301 AD, setting fixed prices for goods and wages across the empire. Unfortunately, this ambitious policy proved difficult to enforce. Merchants often ignored it, and black markets flourished. He also increased taxation to fund the army and the growing bureaucracy. Taxes were now assessed based on both land and population, with regular censuses to keep records accurate. While this ensured a steady flow of revenue, it placed a heavy burden on farmers and common citizens. In some regions, people abandoned their land rather than face the tax collectors. Religiously, Diocletian was a staunch traditionalist. He saw the unity of the empire as tied to the worship of Rome's ancient gods. This belief led to one of the most infamous actions of his reign, the Great Persecution of Christians. Beginning in 303 AD, churches were destroyed, scriptures burned, and thousands of Christians were imprisoned or executed. Far from uniting the empire, These persecutions deepened divisions and created lasting resentment. Despite these harsh measures, Diocletian's reign brought a level of order not seen in decades. By the time he voluntarily abdicated in 305 AD, a rare act for a Roman emperor, the empire was stronger than when he had taken power. But the stability was fragile. The Tetrarchy relied on cooperation between its rulers, and once Diocletian stepped down, rivalries began to emerge. The division of the empire into eastern and western halves, while practical, also set a precedent. Over time, these two regions would grow increasingly separate in culture, economy, and political priorities. When trouble came, they would not always stand together. In the next part, we will see how one man, Constantine the Great, would reunite the empire under a single ruler, change its religion forever, and set it on a new path that would shape the centuries to come. When Diocletian abdicated in 305 AD, his carefully balanced tetrarchy began to fracture almost immediately. The idea of shared power worked as long as the rulers cooperated, but human ambition has always been difficult to contain. Rivalries between the Augusti and Caesars turned into open conflict, and soon the empire was once again at war with itself. Amid this chaos emerged a figure whose name would be remembered for centuries: Constantine. Born around 72 AD in Naissus, in the province of Moesia, Hyundai, Serbia, Constantine was the son of Constantius Chlorus, one of Diocletian's Caesars. From an early age, he experienced the complexities of imperial politics and the harsh realities of military life. When his father died in 306 AD, Constantine's troops proclaimed him emperor. This was not according to the rules of the Tetrarchy, but the legion's loyalty was decisive. Over the next 2 decades, Constantine would fight a series of battles against rival claimants, gradually consolidating power. The most famous of these confrontations took place in 312 AD at the Battle of the Milvian Bridge, just outside Rome. It was here that Constantine reportedly experienced a vision, a cross of light in the sky accompanied by the words, "In this sign, you'll conquer." Whether this vision was divine intervention or a moment of political brilliance, it changed the course of history. Constantine ordered his soldiers to paint the Christian symbol, the Chi-Rho, on their shields. He won the battle decisively, defeating his rival Maxentius, whose army was driven into the Tiber River. The following year, in 313 AD, Constantine issued the Edict of Milan with his co-emperor Licinius. This decree granted full religious tolerance to Christians and restored confiscated church property. For a faith that had been persecuted for centuries, most recently under Diocletian, this was a dramatic and unprecedented shift. Constantine's embrace of Christianity was more than a personal conversion. It marked the beginning of a transformation in the empire's identity. Over time, Christian bishops gained influence in political matters. Church councils, such as the First Council of Nicaea in 325 AD, sought to unify Christian doctrine, often with imperial support. Christianity, once an underground movement, now had the backing of the most powerful state in the known world. But Constantine was not solely focused on religion. He also reshaped the political geography of the empire. Recognizing the strategic and economic advantages of the East, he established a new imperial capital in 330 AD, Constantinople, built on the site of the ancient Greek city of Byzantium. Situated on the Bosporus Strait, the city was a crossroads between Europe and Asia, controlling trade routes and providing a defensible position against invasions. This move symbolized a gradual shift of power from Rome to the eastern provinces. While Rome remained a cultural and symbolic heart, Constantinople became the true center of imperial administration. The East was richer, more urbanized, and better able to withstand external threats. This imbalance would have profound consequences. In the centuries ahead, Constantine's reign brought relative stability, but it also laid the groundwork for future divisions. His dynasty would struggle with internal rivalries, and his endorsement of Christianity would intertwine the church with the state in ways that created both unity and conflict. Perhaps most importantly, Constantine's decision to centralize power in the East strengthened the Eastern Roman Empire, later known as the Byzantine Empire, at the expense of the West. When crises came, the East would survive, but the West would not. In the next part, we will follow the centuries after Constantine, as the western half of the empire faces growing pressures from within and without, pressures that no reform, no capital, and no single ruler could fully resist. After Constantine's death in 337 AD, the Roman Empire was once again divided among his sons. While the eastern half maintained its growing strength, the western half faced a far harsher reality. The seeds of decline had already been planted, and one of the greatest threats came from beyond its borders, the so-called barbarian tribes. For centuries, the Romans had labeled various peoples living outside their frontiers as barbari, a term that meant they did not speak Latin or Greek and did not share Roman customs. This label encompassed a wide range of cultures: Germanic tribes like the Goths, Vandals, and Franks, nomadic peoples like the Huns, and others from the cold forests and plains beyond the Rhine and Danube. Many of these groups had long interacted with the empire, trading goods, sometimes fighting wars, and even serving as mercenaries in the Roman army. But by the 4th century, pressures in the wider world were driving these peoples toward Rome's borders with increasing force. Climate shifts, competition for resources, and the expansion of new powers, especially the terrifying advance of the Huns from Central Asia, created waves of migration. These were not just raiding parties, but entire nations on the move, men, women, children, and their herds, seeking safety and fertile land. Rome's traditional strategy was to keep such peoples at bay through a mix of diplomacy, subsidies, and military defense. Fortified lines along the Rhine and Danube acted as both physical and psychological barriers. Yet maintaining these defenses required constant vigilance, resources, and troops, things the Western Empire was beginning to run short of. In 376 AD, a turning point came. The Goths, fleeing the Huns, sought permission to cross the Danube into Roman territory. Emperor Valens allowed them to settle in the province of Thrace, intending to use them as allies and the buffer against other threats. But corruption among Roman officials, who mistreated and extorted the Goths, turned the arrangement into a disaster. Starving and desperate, the Goths rebelled. 2 years later, in 378 AD, the crisis erupted into open war at the Battle of Adrianople. Valens, underestimating the Gothic forces, engaged them without waiting for reinforcements from the west. The result was a catastrophe. The Roman army was crushed, and Valens himself was killed in battle, his body never found. This defeat was more than just a military loss. It shattered the aura of invincibility that Rome's legions had carried for centuries. After Adrianople, the empire increasingly relied on foederati, barbarian groups settled within Roman territory in exchange for military service. While this arrangement provided short-term manpower, It also eroded the unity of the army. These allied troops often had their own leaders, loyalties, and agendas. In times of crisis, their allegiance to Rome could not always be counted on. Meanwhile, the West's economy was faltering. Agricultural productivity declined as fertile lands were abandoned due to constant raids. Cities shrank, trade diminished, and the tax base eroded. Without the wealth to maintain large standing armies, the Western Empire became even more dependent on barbarian soldiers, some of whom would eventually turn against it. The East, centered in Constantinople, fared better. Its cities remained prosperous, its defenses stronger, and its administration more stable. When barbarian pressures mounted, the East could often buy peace or redirect threats toward the West. This imbalance meant that while the Eastern Roman Empire would endure for another 1,000 years, the western half was left increasingly exposed. By the end of the 4th century, the Western Empire was not yet doomed, but it was undeniably weakened. The frontiers were porous, the army was divided in loyalty, and the economy was fragile. The stage was set for a series of invasions in the 5th century that would tear through the heart of the empire. In the next part, we will witness the events of the early 400s, when the Visigoths, under their king Alaric, would march into Italy itself and do what had once seemed unthinkable: sack the eternal city of Rome. By the dawn of the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire was walking a narrow path between survival and collapse. Its borders were under constant strain, its finances stretched thin, and its political leadership unstable. Into this fragile world stepped one of the most famous figures of the empire's final century, Alaric, king of the Visigoths. Alaric's story began long before he marched on Rome. Born around 370 AD, he was raised in the shadow of Roman power, yet always apart from it. The Visigoths had fought alongside Rome's foederati, allies bound by treaty, but their relationship with the empire was marked by mistrust and mutual need. Alaric himself served in the Roman army as a young man, gaining first-hand knowledge of Roman tactics, politics, and weaknesses. After years of service, Alaric grew disillusioned. The Visigoths, he felt, were treated as second-class allies, used in battle, but denied fair rewards. His ambitions went beyond serving Rome. He wanted a secure homeland for his people and recognition of their power. By 395 AD, after the death of Emperor Theodosius I, Alaric was chosen as king of the Visigoths. The empire, now divided between Theodosius's sons Arcadius in the east and Honorius in the west, entered a period of renewed instability. Alaric saw opportunity. The Roman generals in the west were distracted by other threats, and the new emperors were young and inexperienced. The Visigoth king began leading raids through the Balkans and into Greece, threatening cities like Athens and Corinth, while the Eastern Empire eventually paid him to withdraw. These campaigns made one thing clear: Alaric was no ordinary barbarian leader. He was a strategist, willing to negotiate, but equally ready to use force. In 401 AD, Alaric turned his gaze westward toward Italy itself. This was a bold and dangerous move. For centuries, Italy had been the secure heartland of the empire, rarely touched by foreign armies. But Rome's legions were no longer the unstoppable force they had once been. The empire scrambled to respond, calling on its most capable general, Stilicho, to defend the homeland. Stilicho, of mixed Roman and Vandal heritage, was a brilliant commander and managed to check Alaric's advance in several battles. Yet political intrigue soon undermined even the best defense. Factions within the imperial court distrusted Stilicho's growing influence, and in 408 AD, he was accused of treason and executed. With Rome's greatest general gone, the road to disaster lay open. That same year, Honorius made the fateful decision to stop paying the subsidies that had kept the Visigoths in check. Alaric, interpreting this as a betrayal, marched his army toward Rome, the Eternal City, which had stood for over 8 centuries as the center of a vast empire, now found itself under siege. The first siege in 408 AD ended with negotiation. The Romans paid Alaric a large sum of gold and silver, along with food, to withdraw, but the underlying conflict remained unresolved. In 409 AD, Alaric returned, demanding even greater concessions, including the right for the Visigoths to settle in fertile lands of northern Italy. When talks broke down, he tightened the siege, cutting off supplies and starving the population. Finally, in August of 410 AD, after months of tension and failed diplomacy, the unthinkable happened. Alaric's forces entered Rome. For 3 days, the Visigoths plundered the city. They took gold, silver, and treasures, but spared many buildings and churches, especially those dedicated to the Christian faith. Even so, the psychological shock was enormous. The last time Rome had fallen to a foreign enemy was nearly 800 years earlier. During the Gallic sack of 390 BC, the sack of Rome in 410 AD was not the empire's end, but it was a powerful symbol of its decline. The city that had once ruled the known world was no longer invincible. The news echoed across the Mediterranean, shaking allies and emboldening enemies. Alaric himself did not live long to enjoy his victory. He died later that same year, reportedly, buried in a hidden tomb along a riverbed, the location concealed forever by the laborers who built it, all of whom were put to death to keep the secret. His people, however, remained a force in the crumbling western provinces. In the next part, we will explore how the Western Empire, weakened and humiliated, faced even more waves of invasions, from Vandals, Huns, and other peoples, each strike chipping away at what little strength remained. The sack of Rome in 410 AD was a wound to the prestige of the Western Roman Empire, but it was far from the final blow. In the decades that followed, the West faced new waves of invaders, each more devastating than the last. Among the most infamous were the Vandals and the Huns, two forces whose names would become synonymous with destruction. The Vandals were a Germanic people who, like the Goths, had been pushed westward by the relentless advance of the Huns from the steppes of Central Asia. They crossed the Rhine into Roman Gaul in 406 AD, along with other tribes such as the Alans and Suebi, overwhelming the frontier defenses. From Gaul, they moved into the Iberian Peninsula, carving out territories for themselves. Under their ambitious king, Gaiseric, the Vandals crossed the Strait of Gibraltar in 429 AD into North Africa. This was a masterstroke. North Africa was the breadbasket of the Western Empire, producing much of its grain supply. By 439 AD, Gaiseric had captured Carthage, Rome's jewel in Africa, and turned it into the capital of a Vandal kingdom. The loss was catastrophic. Without North Africa's grain, food shortages became more severe in Italy and other parts of the West. The Vandals, skilled sailors, soon dominated the Western Mediterranean. Their fleets raided coastal towns and disrupted vital trade routes. In 455 AD, they struck a blow that matched the shock of Alaric's sack, the Vandal sack of Rome. Unlike the Visigoths, who had left much of the city intact, The Vandals stripped it of treasures and took thousands of Romans as slaves. The word vandalism would one day be coined from their name, forever linking them to wanton destruction. While the Vandals carved out their empire in the south, another menace loomed in the heart of Europe. The Huns, fierce horsemen from the steppes. The Huns were unmatched in mobility and ferocity. Their arrival had set in motion the great migrations that had already destabilized Rome's borders. By the mid-5th century, the Huns were united under a single ruler, Attila, known to history as the Scourge of God. Between 440 and 450 AD, Attila's armies ravaged the Balkans, invaded Gaul, and even threatened Italy itself. His campaigns brought devastation on a scale that shocked contemporaries. Entire towns were burned, their inhabitants killed or enslaved. The psychological impact was as great as the physical destruction. To many, Attila seemed an unstoppable force. In 451 AD, the Romans, allied with the Visigoths, confronted Attila at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in Gaul. The battle was massive and bloody, and while Attila was forced to withdraw, the victory was temporary. The very fact that Rome needed barbarian allies to stop another barbarian leader showed how far its military power had declined. The following year, Attila invaded Italy, burning cities and threatening Rome itself. Only the intervention of Pope Leo I, who met Attila in person, prevented the sack of the city. The reasons Attila withdrew remain debated: famine, disease, and the need to address troubles back home. All have played a part. Whatever the cause, Rome was spared. For the moment, when Attila died suddenly in 453 AD, his empire quickly fragmented, but the damage to Rome was already done. The constant wars, the loss of territories, the breakdown of trade, and the dependence on unreliable allies had drained the Western Empire to the core. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire controlled little more than Italy and parts of Gaul. Its emperors were often figureheads, manipulated by powerful generals or barbarian leaders who held real power. The Eastern Empire in Constantinople still sent aid at times, but its priorities were increasingly focused on its own survival. In the next part, we will follow the empire's final decades, a slow, weary decline that ended not with a grand battle, but with the quiet deposition of a boy emperor. The end of Rome in the West would be both an end and a beginning, as new kingdoms rose from its ruins. By the mid-5th century, the Western Roman Empire was a shadow of its former self. Its territory had shrunk dramatically. Britannia was lost, most of Spain and Gaul were under barbarian control, and North Africa was firmly in Vandal hands. What remained of imperial authority was concentrated in Italy and a few scattered provinces. The emperors in Ravenna, the capital since 402 AD, were no longer the commanding figures of old, but often pawns in the hands of powerful generals. One of these generals was Flavius Itius, sometimes called the last of the Romans. Itius had been instrumental in forging alliances with barbarian groups, notably the Visigoths, to fend off the Huns at the Battle of the Catalonian Plains in 451 AD. His skill and diplomacy kept the fragile remnants of the empire intact, but even his influence could not save Rome from political intrigue. In 454 AD, Emperor Valentinian III, perhaps fearing Etius's growing power, assassinated him with his own hand during a meeting in the palace. It was a fatal mistake. Without Itius, the empire had no true defender. The very next year, Valentinian himself was murdered by two former supporters of Itius, leaving the empire leaderless and vulnerable. Into this chaos stepped Petronius Maximus, who seized the throne, but reigned for only a few months before the Vandals sailed into Rome and sacked it again in 455 AD. The city's humiliation deepened. This time, the plundering was systematic and thorough. The once proud heart of the empire seemed defenseless before its enemies. In the following 2 decades, the throne of the Western Empire became almost a revolving door. Emperors rose and fell with dizzying speed, often installed or deposed by barbarian generals who commanded the real military power. One of the most influential of these was Ricimer, a Germanic warrior who acted as kingmaker, choosing and discarding emperors to suit his needs. His dominance marked the final erosion of the traditional Roman political order. Meanwhile, the Eastern Empire in Constantinople still recognized the Western emperors in name, but offered little real help. The East had its own struggles with Persians, internal revolts, and maintaining its wealth. The Western provinces were seen as a sinking ship, and few wanted to go down with it. By the 470s, the Western Empire was reduced to little more than Italy, parts of Gaul, and a tenuous hold on Dalmatia. The population of Rome had dwindled from over 1 million in its glory days to perhaps a fraction of that, its grand monuments standing as hollow reminders of a lost age. Trade had withered, roads fell into disrepair, and the Roman army was largely composed of barbarian mercenaries who served for pay rather than loyalty. It was in this bleak landscape that the last emperor would rise, or rather, be placed on the throne. In 475 AD, a boy named Romulus Augustulus was crowned emperor. His name, a combination of Rome's legendary founder and its first emperor, Augustus, seemed almost symbolic, a circle closing. Yet Romulus was not destined to be a savior. He was little more than a figurehead, installed by his father, the general Orestes, who hoped to rule through his son. But Orestes soon made a critical mistake. He refused to grant land in Italy to the barbarian troops under the command of Odoacer, a leader of Germanic origin. In response, Odoacer rebelled, marching his forces toward Ravenna. In September 476 AD, he captured the city, executed Orestes, and deposed Romulus Augustulus. Odoacer did not claim the imperial title. Instead, he sent the imperial regalia to Constantinople, declaring that the West no longer needed its own emperor. One ruler in the East was enough. This act is traditionally marked as the fall of the Western Roman Empire. The date, 476 AD, has become a symbol in history books, the end of ancient Rome in the West and the beginning of the Middle Ages in Europe. But in truth, the transformation was gradual. Many Roman institutions, laws, and traditions lived on in the kingdoms that replaced the empire. Yet the world had changed forever. In the next part, we will reflect on the legacy of Rome, how its fall was not just an end, but a seed from which medieval Europe would grow, carrying forward the echoes of an empire that once ruled the known world. The fall of the Western Roman Empire in 476 AD is often described as a sudden, dramatic event, a curtain closing on the ancient world, but in reality, it was more like the slow fading of daylight into dusk. The structures of Rome did not vanish overnight. They evolved, adapted, and, in many ways, endured. The story after the fall as much about continuity as it is about collapse. When Odoacer deposed Romulus Augustulus, he did not destroy the machinery of government. He adopted many Roman customs and retained much of the administrative system, using Roman officials to manage daily affairs. Latin remained the language of administration. Roman law continued to be applied, and the Senate in Rome still met. though with far less influence than before dotting the cities and countryside. Life for many people went on much as it had before. Farmers still tilled the land, markets still traded goods, and churches rang their bells. But beneath this surface of continuity lay deep changes. The old network of Roman roads, once the arteries of an empire, fell into disrepair without the central funding to maintain them. Long-distance trade diminished, and economies became more localized. The Christian Church emerged as one of the most powerful unifying forces in the post-Roman world. Even as imperial authority crumbled, bishops held influence over communities, acting as moral leaders, diplomats, and sometimes even military negotiators. The Pope in Rome, though not yet the universal authority he would later become, began to play a more prominent role in guiding the spiritual and political life of the West. In Gaul, Spain, and Italy, new kingdoms arose, ruled by former feudati and their descendants. The Ostrogoths, under Theodoric the Great, would take control of Italy after overthrowing Odoacer in 493 AD, establishing a kingdom that sought to preserve much of the Roman heritage. In Gaul, the Franks began their rise, laying the foundations for what would one day become France. In Spain, the Visigoths consolidated their rule, blending Roman legal traditions with their own customs. The fall of Rome also marked a shift in the balance of power between East and West. The Eastern Roman Empire, known to modern historians as the Byzantine Empire, would continue for nearly 1,000 years after 476 AD, preserving and transforming Roman governance, art, and culture. Constantinople became the new Rome, a fortress, city of trade, learning, and faith. From there, emperors would sometimes attempt to reclaim lost Western territories, with varying degrees of success. Yet the West was not simply a broken remnant. It was a world in transformation. Roman ideas about law, citizenship, and architecture influenced the emerging medieval kingdoms. The Latin language evolved into the Romance languages, Italian, French, Spanish, Portuguese, and Romanian, carrying echoes of Rome into the modern age. For many in the centuries after the fall, Rome remained a symbol of unity and order, an ideal to aspire to. Charlemagne, crowned emperor of the Romans in 800 AD by the Pope, deliberately styled his Rome as a revival of the Roman Empire. Even in the Renaissance, 1,000 years later, scholars, artists, and architects would look back to ancient Rome as a golden age of human achievement. The fall of Rome, then, was not just an ending. It was a transformation. The Western provinces became a patchwork of kingdoms, each with its own identity, yet all touched by the Roman legacy. That legacy shaped Europe's laws, languages, religion, and sense of history for centuries to come. In the next part, we will step back from the narrative to examine the deeper causes of Rome's fall, the economic, military, political, and cultural factors that intertwined over centuries to bring down one of the greatest empires the world has ever known. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not the result of a single battle, a single emperor's mistake, or one catastrophic invasion. It was the outcome of a complex web of problems, economic, military, political, and cultural, woven together over centuries. Understanding these root causes helps explain why an empire that had stood for over 1,000 years could not survive the pressures of its final centuries. One of the most significant factors was economic decline. Rome's wealth had once been built on conquest, plunder, and the tribute of subject peoples. As expansion slowed in the 2nd century AD, the flow of new resources diminished. Maintaining the empire's vast borders required a standing army, paid in gold, equipped with arms, and supplied with food. Taxes increased, burdening farmers and urban citizens alike. Over time, more and more land was concentrated in the hands of the wealthy elite, leaving small farmers struggling or forced into debt slavery. Trade also suffered. In the early centuries, Rome's well-maintained roads and maritime routes facilitated commerce across the Mediterranean and beyond. But constant warfare in the 3rd and 4th centuries disrupted these routes. Piracy and banditry increased, and merchants faced greater risks. With North Africa's grain supplies to the Vandals in the 5th century, Rome's ability to feed its population collapsed. Food shortages led to inflation, and the currency, once backed by precious metals, was debased, further undermining economic stability. The military challenges were equally daunting. Rome's army was once composed of disciplined, loyal citizens and subject peoples who were rewarded with land and citizenship. By the later centuries, however, recruitment became increasingly difficult. Many Roman citizens avoided military service, leading to a growing reliance on mercenaries and foederati, barbarian allies who served for pay or land grants. While some of these troops were effective, their loyalty was often to their commanders, not to Rome itself. This created dangerous situations where entire units could rebel or shift allegiance in times of crisis. Politically, the empire suffered from chronic instability. Between 235 and 284 AD, the so-called crisis of the 3rd century, Rome saw over 20 emperors come and go, most dying violently. Even after some stability was restored under Diocletian and Constantine, succession remained a dangerous game. Assassinations, coups, and civil wars were frequent, draining resources and dividing the empire's focus. Every internal conflict weakened Rome's ability to deal with external threats. The division of the empire into Eastern and Western halves, while initially a practical solution for administration, created long-term imbalances. The East, with its richer cities, stronger economy, and more defensible borders, often outshone the West. Resources and political attention gravitated toward Constantinople, leaving the Western provinces with fewer reinforcements and less financial aid. When crises struck, culturally, Rome was also transforming. The rise of Christianity brought profound changes to the empire's values and priorities. While the new faith united many under a shared belief, it also shifted focus away from the old Roman ideals of civic duty and military service. The empire was no longer bound together by the same set of traditions and myths that had once given it a shared identity. Finally, there was the relentless pressure from outside forces. The migrations and invasions of the 4th and 5th centuries, Visigoths, Vandals, Huns, Ostrogoths, were not isolated events, but part of a broader movement of peoples across Europe and Asia. Rome's borders were too long, its defenses too thin, and its resources too depleted to withstand these repeated blows. In short, Rome fell because too many problems converged at once. Economic weakness sapped its strength, political instability eroded its unity, military dependence undermined its security, and cultural transformation altered its identity. By the time the final invasions came, the empire in the West no longer had the resilience to recover. In the next part, we will explore how historians over the centuries have debated the meaning of Rome's fall, and why this story continues to fascinate and teach lessons even today. For more than 1500 years, the fall of the Western Roman Empire has fascinated historians, philosophers, and storytellers. It has been seen as a warning, a tragedy, a transformation, and even as an inevitable cycle in the life of great civilizations. Each era has interpreted Rome's collapse through its own lens, asking not only how it happened, but what it meant in the centuries immediately after 476 AD. Many writers, especially those in the Eastern Roman Empire, saw the fall of the West as a cautionary tale about moral decline. Christian historians such as St. Augustine, writing in the early 5th century during the sack of Rome by the Visigoths, argued that the empire's troubles were not a sign that Christianity had weakened it, as some claimed, but proof that earthly kingdoms rise and fall according to God's will. Augustine's City of God framed Rome's collapse within a spiritual narrative, teaching that only the City of God, the eternal kingdom of heaven, was truly lasting. During the Middle Ages, the idea of Rome as a lost golden age took hold. Monks, chroniclers, and rulers like Charlemagne looked back to Rome as the model of order and unity. They interpreted the empire's fall as both a disaster and an opportunity. A disaster because it ended centralized authority, but an opportunity because it allowed new Christian kingdoms to emerge. In this sense, medieval Europe was built on both the ruins and the memory of Rome. The Renaissance brought a new wave of reflection. Humanist scholars, such as Petrarch, saw the fall of Rome as a tragedy that had plunged Europe into a dark age of ignorance and chaos. They idealized ancient Rome's art, literature, and governance, urging a revival of classical learning as a way to recapture some of its greatness. For them, the collapse was not inevitable. It was a failure to uphold the virtues and knowledge of the ancients. In the Enlightenment of the 17th and 18th centuries, historians like Edward Gibbon took a more secular and analytical approach. Gibbon's monumental work, The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, argued that Rome fell because of a combination of internal weakness and external pressure, but he also controversially claimed that the rise of Christianity played a role, shifting focus away from civic duty and military readiness. Gibbon's sharp, sometimes cynical style helped shape how the fall of Rome was discussed for generations. Modern historians, especially in the 20th and 21st centuries, tend to reject the idea of a single cause or a sudden collapse. Instead, they speak of a transformation rather than a fall. They emphasize the continuity between the late Roman world and the early medieval kingdoms, pointing out that Roman laws, language, and infrastructure survived long. Over 476 AD, this view suggests that the fall was more a slow evolution, as the empire's western half adapted to new political realities. There are also debates about how much responsibility lies with Rome itself versus external forces. Some argue that Rome's overextension, economic mismanagement, and political corruption set the stage for disaster, making it vulnerable to outside attack. Others point to the sheer scale of the migrations and invasions in the late 4th and 5th centuries, events that might have overwhelmed even a stronger empire. What makes the story of Rome's fall so enduring is that it invites comparison. People see echoes of it in their own times. Empires that seem uncheckable yet face economic strain, political division, and challenges from rising powers. Rome's story becomes a mirror in which later generations examine their own strengths and weaknesses. In the next part, we will explore some of the myths and misconceptions about the fall of Rome, the stories people tell, the symbols they use, and the truths that often lie hidden beneath them. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is one of the most retold events in world history, but with frequent retelling comes the spread of myths and misconceptions. Some are born from misunderstanding, others from the romantic imagination of later centuries. These myths, while captivating, can cloud the more complex and fascinating truth behind Rome's long decline. One of the most common misconceptions is that Rome fell in a single day in 476 AD. In reality, the year 476 is simply a convenient marker used by historians representing the deposition of the last Western emperor, Romulus Augustulus, by Odoacer. The transformation from imperial Rome to medieval Europe was gradual, taking place over many decades. In some places, Roman administration, laws, and customs continued well into the Middle Ages. For the people living through it, there was no single moment when they could say, Rome has fallen. Another myth is that barbarian invasions completely destroyed Roman civilization. While the invasions brought violence and disruption, many so-called barbarians admired Roman culture and adopted parts of it. The Ostrogoths in Italy, the Visigoths in Spain, and the Franks in Gaul all retained aspects of Roman law, infrastructure, and governance. Far from erasing Rome, these kingdoms blended Roman traditions with their own, creating the cultural foundations for medieval Europe. A popular romantic image that Rome fell because of moral decay and luxury, that its citizens grew weak and decadent, unwilling to defend their empire. This view, popularized by writers like Gibbon, simplifies a far more complex reality. While corruption and political instability were real problems, they existed alongside genuine resilience, cultural achievements, and military skill. The late empire faced immense pressures that went far beyond personal morality. There is also the misconception that Christianity caused the fall of Rome. While the rise of Christianity did change Roman society and values, the empire had already been struggling for centuries before it became the dominant religion. Christianity may have redirected resources and focus, but it also provided a unifying moral framework that endured long after the empire's political structures collapsed. A more subtle myth is that the fall of Rome helped the beginning of a dark age, a time of ignorance, stagnation, and barbarism. Modern historians have challenged this idea, pointing out that while some areas suffered decline, others saw continuity and even growth. Knowledge was preserved in monasteries, trade persisted in certain regions, and art and architecture continued to evolve. The term Dark Ages says more about the Renaissance view of the Middle Ages than about the actual conditions of the time. Even the image of the last Roman is more complicated than it seems. While Romulus Augustulus is remembered as the final emperor, there were Roman officials, generals, and citizens who continued to think of themselves as Romans long after his reign. In the East, the Byzantine Empire would proudly call itself Roman until its fall in 1453. These myths endure because they are compelling stories and because they offer simple explanations for a complex event. But the real history of Rome's fall is richer, more intricate, and more human. It is a story of adaptation as well as loss, of persistence as well as collapse. In the next part, we will look beyond Rome itself, exploring how the empire's fall reshaped the wider world, from the shifting balance of power in Europe to the echoes of Rome that reached far into Asia and Africa. The fall of the Western Roman Empire was not simply a European event. Its ripples spread far beyond the old imperial borders, altering the course of history in regions that had never been directly ruled by Rome. To understand the full weight of its collapse, we must step back and view it on a global stage. In Europe, the immediate effect was the fragmentation of political power. where once a single authority had ruled vast territories from Britain to North Africa. Now a patchwork of kingdoms emerged. This decentralization created instability, but it also allowed for cultural diversity and local innovation. Over time, new political identities formed. The Franks in Gaul, the Anglo-Saxons in Britain, the Visigoths in Spain, each blending Roman heritage with their own traditions. This reshaping of Europe laid the groundwork for the nations that would later dominate the continent. The Eastern Roman Empire, or Byzantine Empire, took on a new role after the West's fall. No longer sharing the burden of defending both halves, Constantinople focused on preserving Roman culture, law, and diplomacy. Byzantine merchants and diplomats expanded trade networks into the Middle East, Central Asia, and the Mediterranean, acting as a bridge between Europe and the rest of the world. For centuries, they claimed to be the true Rome, keeping the imperial flame alive while watching the West reinvent itself. In the Middle East and North Africa, the absence of a strong Western Rome created opportunities for new powers to rise. The Vandal kingdom in North Africa briefly dominated Mediterranean trade routes until it was conquered by the Byzantines in the 6th century. Later, the Arab caliphates would sweep across the region, inheriting and transforming parts of Rome's economic and intellectual legacy. Roman engineering, agricultural techniques, and urban planning influenced Islamic cities from Cairo to Damascus. In Asia, the fall of Rome indirectly altered the flow of goods along the Silk Road, with Western Europe fractured. Demand for luxury, goods like silk, spices, and precious stones shifted toward the Byzantine and Islamic worlds. Eastern empires, including China's dynasties, still saw Rome or Qin in Chinese records as a distant counterpart, but their primary trading partners became the powers that replaced Rome's influence in the Mediterranean. Even Africa south of the Sahara felt the change. Roman trade with the African interior, in gold, ivory, and exotic animals, had once flowed through Carthage and other North African ports. With the Vandals and later the Byzantines controlling these areas, the patterns of trade shifted. Over time, Islamic North Africa would connect sub-Saharan trade routes to the wider Mediterranean economy. But the Roman presence was gone. One of the most profound legacies of the fall was in the realm of ideas. The notion of empire, a single ruler over many peoples and lands, remained a powerful ideal. Charlemagne, the Holy Roman Emperors, the Russian Tsars, and even some Islamic caliphs saw themselves as heirs to Rome in different ways. Rome's legal systems, architectural styles, and military organization became reference points for rulers across continents. Culturally, the collapse of centralized Roman authority allowed Christianity to spread in new directions. Missionaries carried the faith into northern and eastern Europe, where it mingled with local beliefs and customs. In the East, the Byzantine Orthodox tradition developed its own distinct identity, influencing the Slavic world and parts of Asia Minor. The fall of Rome also influenced the imagination of later generations far from its borders. In China, scholars debated the fate of distant empires. In the Islamic world, Rome was remembered in the Quran and in historical chronicles as both a rival and a civilization of great achievement. In Africa, oral traditions sometimes spoke of vast empires that rose and fell, echoing the pattern of Rome's story. What makes Rome's fall unique in world history is not just its scale, but the way its memory persisted. Even as new powers rose, the shadow of Rome stretched across continents, shaping how people thought about power, culture, and history itself. In the final part of our journey, we will return to the heart of the story, reflecting on why the fall of Rome still matters, and what it can teach us about the cycles of history that continue to shape our world today. The story of the Western Roman Empire's fall is not just about the past, it is also about the present, and perhaps even the future. We tell it again and again, not simply to recall a vanished world, but because in its rise, its glory, its struggles, and its decline, we find patterns that speak to all human societies. Rome's fall matters because it was, in many ways, a mirror of ourselves. It was an empire that mastered organization, engineering, and governance on a scale never before seen. Its roads stretched across continents, its aqueducts brought water to millions, its laws shaped justice for centuries. Yet it was also an empire plagued by inequality, political division, and the constant challenge of managing diversity within its borders. When we study the fall, we are not only looking at what went wrong, we are also looking at what held Rome together for so long. The combination of infrastructure, law, and cultural adaptability allowed it to survive crises that would have destroyed lesser states. But even these strengths had limits. As pressures grew, economic strain, political instability, external threats, the ability to respond weakened. The fall reminds us that no system, however great, is immune to change. For modern readers and listeners, the fall of Rome offers lessons in humility. It challenges the belief that any civilization can remain at its peak forever. Great powers today face their own challenges: climate change, economic inequality, technological upheaval, political polarization. While the circumstances differ, the underlying truth remains: stability depends on resilience, adaptability, and a willingness to confront problems before they grow too great to solve. Rome's fall also offers hope. While the empire itself crumbled, much of its knowledge, culture, and spirit endured. The Latin language evolved into the Romance languages. Roman law continued to shape legal systems. The Christian Church, born in the empire's shadow, became a central institution in Europe for over a millennium. The dream of unity and shared culture, though transformed, survived in new forms. On a more human level, the fall of Rome is a reminder that history is not just the story of rulers and armies. It is also the story of ordinary people, farmers who tended their fields, merchants who adapted to new markets, families who adjusted to new rulers. For them, the end of the empire was not always the end of their world. Life went on, shaped by change, but not extinguished by it. As we close this journey through the fall of Rome, we might think of the city itself. Rome did not disappear in 476 AD. Its streets still echoed with footsteps, its walls still stood, and its people still lived their lives. Over time, it became a symbol of endurance, of transformation, of the way the past lives on within the present. History is full of rises and falls. The fall of the Western Roman Empire is just one of many, but it remains one of the most vivid because it speaks to universal truths: that all things change, that power is fleeting, but that culture and memory can outlast even the mightiest of states. And so, as you drift towards sleep, let the story of Rome be not a tale of loss, but a quiet reminder that from every ending comes a beginning. The stones of Rome still stand, its ideas still breathe in our laws, our languages, and our dreams. The empire may be gone, but its spirit, in 1,000 small ways, is still with us.